Following up on what Junaidi mentioned, I think my next question is aligned for that. Basically, what are the biggest challenges on infusing our cultural heritage in games? I mean, what's the difficulty? What's the challenges that we are facing to be able to do it right, or to even like which part of culture should we cover or should we expose in our game? How does that work, and how do we decide we are doing it in the best manner possible, kind of thing? Yeah.
I'll take that first. Number one, it's very difficult to know what is good about your culture unless you deliberately get out of your culture. If you stay within your environment, you are used to seeing everything around here. It's very difficult to explain to others why foreigners like our food. And we hear all the time, right? We hear that the idea, like when people come to Malaysia, they always talk about food, food, food. And you get it, okay, foreigners like Malaysian food. But you won't understand why unless you go out and actually try what they eat. And then you realize what they've been missing. There was a Japanese photographer who cited that the most difficult topic he has to cover is actually Japanese environments, because he grew up with it. When you grow up with something that other people see special, you wonder, why do you think it's special? I grew up with this. You need to go out, be in an environment where you don't have it, then you'd realize why other people value it. So that is one of the when it comes to trying to pick what is it that we should put in the entertainment depiction, because sometimes we don't know what other people will value. Wayang kulit, for example, to us it's perhaps a normal thing. It's like something from history. When Pusaka took the wayang kulit performers to the States, and you gotta understand this, they're not translating it, they're not converting the content for the Americans to understand, they're giving the performance as is. So you assume that most people there will not understand it. They had sold out performances everywhere they go in America. And that's because they saw something they like that we don't even know because we're so used to it. Now, when it's very difficult to pinpoint what is it that we want to promote, we need guidelines. We need to figure out, like, okay, generally what do we put? Do we put our costumes? Do we put our traditions? Do we put elements that we think that other people should know about? And the other problem is trying to figure out what is the guideline in putting real content in a fantasy environment. Because like what me and Junaidi were mentioning just now, if you try to simulate a real environment, it is very easy for people to say, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And you lose the intent of the design, which is to make sure people have fun. But if you take a world like a Final Fantasy world, where everything is made up, it's mishmash. There is no real connection between the costumes and the environment and the traditions and the creatures. It's all fantasy. People stop judging. And when people stop judging and you deliberately put in a real world reference, people are happier. So the problem with trying to make something authentic is that it is so easy to pinpoint what's wrong with it. Whereas if you do something in a fantasy setting, it is easy to put in a real life reference inside and get people happy because they noticed it. If people don't notice it, that's fine. It didn't harm their enjoyment. But for people who knew the reference, they loved it more. So the thing is, in the end, games have to be fun. You don't have to make it super real. It can still be fantasy. But if you try to make something super realistic, you have a problem where it stops being fun for the people playing the game.
What was the question again, Buzz?
What are the challenges? What are the biggest challenges in infusing cultural heritage in games? What do you see? Is it the cost? Is it the knowledge? Is it the...
I think it's always the context. I think it's always, because almost all the products and franchises I've worked on is all about real stuff, as real as it gets. Like how a university in can't remember, somewhere in the States used Assassin's Creed Revelations or Brotherhood to do the virtual tour of Rome. to teach their students, because they couldn't do it properly using Google, because they were trying to cover a history subject within that era. So they walked around, because it's an open world game, the player could just walk around and do nothing, and went around Rome to get a feeling of it, right? And I guess it worked, because the student understood, and the report said they did better, and they kind of liked that subject more, because they had interactivity to use it in what they're studying. Probably not too deep, but as long as they could virtually immerse themselves in a location. But there are some that we were challenged with. For example, in Assassin's Creed 3, where we were doing American history, the Revolution, and Americans are very proud of that, and it wasn't an easy one to get right. So we probably won a few and lost a few in the sense of credibility. And I guess those would be the challenges, to like Hilmi mentioned, there's a guideline, and making a fantasy game, the guideline is probably looser. But I guess what I find fun to do with this real and highly credible franchises is that it challenges myself as a content creator to properly get it right, to properly do my research, to properly educate my own self to do it. So a lot of people think, making games, you have to be just focusing on the fun stuff. Yes, for sure, that is always our priority. Then comes the credibility, that comes all the other things trails behind it. But it will all the other things will destroy the fun factor if you don't get it right. And then another thing that I thought of was also when when working on titles like this, it's not harmful to throw in some fantasy stuff into the real game. Like I throw in so many fictional brands in Need for Speed just because we couldn't license them. So for me as a developer, that's the most fun stuff. It's challenging, but it's fun. I get to take brands like Coca-Cola and fictionalize it. Take McDonald's and like, oh, what should I do? And we build a museum with its sculptures and all that, but we couldn't actually make it exactly that. So we fictionalize it, but it's still a strong. It has a strong credibility there. It doesn't break the illusion that you're in a city. So the challenges usually makes us grow, educate us. So if you're in a situation where you have to push for credibility and fun, we just have to make sure we educate ourselves and immerse ourselves in a place or in a history where we've never been to. So yeah.
Looking at it from different side of it, from commercial perspective of it, right? That sad to say, that is one of the biggest factor to consider where we're developing any kind of creative content. Whether it is a sellable content, whether you can actually make something out of it in terms of commercial value. And in order to achieve that, you got to make sure that people will love it, people will be able to enjoy it, right? So from that challenge alone, trigger few other smaller challenges, right? If you were to take something really authentic of a culture or heritage that might work in some part of the country, in some part of the world, but not work somewhere else, so that is already a challenge in itself. But Alitt put it in a good way just now, that you get something real and you fantasize about it a bit and you put in whatever element that works, right? Bazil also mentioned the story about Romance of Three Kingdoms. The core of the thing is actually, it's about fighting and war at the same time, but they romanticize the thing, put in some element that is acceptable to all walks of life, which is love, right? Then everybody seems to be open to the idea and seems a bit more acceptance towards it, right? And to give an example, one of the biggest franchise in terms of creative content around today, Star Wars, right? It was created out of pure fiction, galaxy battle and stuff. And there's a group of Malaysian performers, Tin Toy and the gang, that they do Star Wars in wayang kulit form. They localize the thing and perform it in a pure wayang kulit style with modern technology. It changed the name, localized the character. Darth Vader was changed to Sang Kala Vade, something like that. They've been doing their performance. And that kind of activity is so good, and works so well that people likes it, because it is not only the fanboy of Star Wars likes it, but the people who have no idea about Star Wars but appreciate the culture element of wayang kulit learn to appreciate that as well. And believe it or not, Disney, didn't know what to do with it, because it is their IP, copyrighted to them, belongs to them. But they also see the value of having that Star Wars characters transformed into wayang kulit, right? But they couldn't make out any commercial deal just yet. But they're willing to say, you know what, go ahead and do, and we're gonna look at it as perspective of you doing an exhibition work rather than commercial work. So they green light it partially in that way. So saying that if you do it right, you overcome the challenge in creative way, you could turn things around. Wayang kulit that might not work, might not gonna be as popular in Italy maybe compared to Nusantara, now find a new breath of life because of Star Wars. Who would have thought so, right? And this group of people has been traveling around performing wayang kulit of Star Wars, is it? So the challenges always be whether it could be a commercially success is one thing, but the core problem is whether it could be turned into something that people would be able to enjoy. And apparently, Hilmi has mentioned it, Alitt has worked on it. There are a few ways, more than one ways that you could work on in order to overcome that challenge. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for very, very interesting perspective on what are the challenges on that. Before I sort of like touch the point, we're now open the floor to question after my next two questions, and then if you have any question, feel free to jot it down and then just ask afterwards. I think coming to that point, because it's a very tough question, it's just like what are the challenges, why we're not doing it right, or how to do it right kind of thing. I think there was 3 points touched by all the 3 panels in a different aspect. I mean, Hilmi touched on the fantasy and real setting, where in fantasy world you have a lot more loose expectation or judgmentalness from the audience that you don't get that pavement right, or you don't get that signboard right. They don't have that the attention to details, and they're not questioning every single detail because it's by default fantasy. But when you try to do something like you say it is heavy on history, then by default people will naturally want to analyze in a lot of details. And I think that's where Final Fantasy probably is easier to infuse cultural heritage into Final Fantasy. Like now they're having Tetari on Chanai, and people won't question it as much. People more likely like, hey, what's that? That's kind of cool. It's a fantasy world, right? And it could be long, in 10 years, 20 years time, there will be Chanai everywhere or Tetari everywhere. God knows, right? On the other one, I think Alitt touches about context, the context of implementing the cultural heritage in games, and I think that's very, very important. The one thing that I think touching on how to do it really badly is when you get the context wrong, where you say like, okay, we're gonna have a space shoot 'em up, and let's pick wayang kulit with it, right? Wayang kulit shoot 'em up, a mashed up of it. So the one thing about wayang kulit is actually it's made out of the bamboo, and there's a way to control the puppet, right? And in a shoot 'em up, there's a basic mechanic of space ship that can move freely and shoot bullets, whereas in wayang kulit, the character can only move 2 limbs, actually 3 limbs, the hand and the mouth, right? So, and I think that's where the context has to be done right. I mean, if it's suitable, if it makes sense to have that cultural taste being infused, then that's something that you can explore. But do it very religiously in the sense of you need to do your research, you need to understand the culture and respect the culture to be able to infuse it. And lastly, I think the point that starts the commercial aspect of cultural heritage in games. Because imagine we are a group of there was a tribe somewhere in Africa, or is it South America? There's less than 1,000 people living with that culture. And if you were to make a game strongly based on the culture, just to explore and expose the culture out, it's going to be very difficult to commercialize because there is no familiarity for other people outside of that culture. And I think that's where Hayao Miyazaki did really great job in terms of infusing culture. For those of you who don't know, he's the person who directed Spirited Away and a lot of the animations, the great animations from Japan. I've been to Ghibli Museum in Mitaka, Tokyo, many times. It's amazing, amazing museum to go. The most interesting part that I find out is that a huge section of the museum were dedicated on studying the Venetian culture. Hayao Miyazaki have a strong fascination towards Italy and the riverbanks, right? So a lot of his movie, you can see there's two kind of movie that a Ghibli Museum produced, right? When under Miyazaki, you have the one that is Japanese culture, you have the one that is very European Renaissance culture, and looking at the amount of books and reference images, he even have a bicycle from the Venetian era in the office as part of his reference point, because people cycle a lot back then. And I think that shows the respect towards a culture that he doesn't come from, but he admire the culture and he want to infuse those culture in his creation. And you can see when someone with that level of respect, that level of admiration towards the culture, when they infuse this cultural heritage in their creation, they generally do it right, because the first thing that they do, they respect the culture first. And looking at Miyazaki with his community in his stories, even when we talk about like Spirited Away, right? It is a Japanese culture, but the whole fantasy mystical world is something that a lot more cultures relate to. We have our own ghosts, right? Chinese have their own ghosts. Indians have their own ghosts, and South Americans probably have their own ghosts. So I think there are certain threads of community. Junaidi touched about love in Romance of Three Kingdoms, and I think those are something that you could make it as the core, because as part of our culture, there are communities of us as human beings, be it compassion, love, struggle, friendship. There's a lot of things that we find common, and I think that's where a lot of great film directors and creators actually took those essence and infused with whatever they feel familiar with from their culture. So, moving on, the next question was what Junaidi touched. Let's just elaborate a little bit more on what he mentioned about the Wayang Kulit Star Wars infusion. So there is actually Peperangan Bintang Wayang Kulit. Yeah, so the Wayang Kulit Peperangan Bintang is created by Tintoy Chuo and Pak Daim. Pak Daim is one of famous Wayang Kulit puppeteer. Tok Dalang, he's the Tok Dalang for Wayang Kulit, and he's hailed from Kelantan, not sure which part of Kelantan. But what happened that I got to know is that Tintoy Chuo went to Kota Baru or some part of Kelantan for a month or a few weeks to stay with Pak Daim, so that he can go through the whole process of Wayang Kulit creation, from creating the equipment and practicing for the performance and to actual performance. That he did that before he even bothered to try to infuse Star Wars into Peperangan Bintang, to become a Peperangan Bintang. And I think recently they just did the Marvel and DC, so they had Superman and also Batman in Wayang Kulit as well. And it looks beautiful. I mean, and I think one of the thing that I like to mention is that he respected both culture very strongly. He's a Star Wars fan. He's also he loved and respect Wayang Kulit. So with that level of admiration and respect, he approached the delicate topic of fusing